Welcome back, guys. We have Kevin Still on the show today from Kevin Still Consulting. He's also a member of our advisory board. And on today's AI Unplugged podcast, we're going to dive into Kevin's world, what he does, how he helps people, how he supports Mega, what his views are on the industry, some key insights that a lot of people can get a competitive edge on. And then we'll dive into the second half of the episode, which is going to be around AI, and basically, Kevin, exactly how you believe or your theories on the market, how it should be implementing AI, leveraging AI for the right things in connection with the whole PSR vulnerability kind of environment that we're trying to get into or trying to support. So people can have like a good amount of insight into what your world actually looks like. So Kevin, hand it over right to you. Who are you? What do you do, and why should anybody stay on this podcast for the next hour and listen to what we have to say? You are a LinkedIn player. What kind of pain did that create for you and your business?
Hi, Shane. Yeah, I hopefully will keep it pretty upbeat and at pace. But my background very much started in IT back in the dawn of time, with things like Swift, with Unisys and IBM, and the world's moved on a lot since then. But very strong background in information management, the credit information world, decisioning, automation, neural networks, and then as we evolve forward into AI. I have a very mixed portfolio, so I'm a director of a number of firms. I'm chief executive of a trade association, the Debt Managers Standards Association. I'm a non-exec for a number of firms, including the Vulnerability Registration Service. And I am a director of Consumer Duty Services, which is very much around both innovation, but also safeguarding consumers and putting the right guardrails in place. And I think we're going to be talking about that a bit today, striking the right balance between innovation and the right safeguards in place, particularly around wider use of AI at scale. So, that my original corporate world probably stood me in good stead. I've worked in the US, across Europe, lived in Europe, as well as spent some time in the States in my sophomore year many years ago. And I continue to be very much involved in that sort of wider universe, particularly where that's relevant to things like operational resilience, as well as some of the innovative topics where regulations like DORA from Europe are just as applicable in the UK now, where we've seen 2 or 3 incidents of late around sort of paydays from mainstream tier 1 banks. And that's a key factor in building trust, empathy with a number of the client types that I deal with, who are typically either in financial difficulty, problem debt, or maybe suffering from the needs of additional support.
So why should anybody stay on the show? Why should anybody stay here for the next hour and listen?
I think we're doing some quite innovative stuff, Shane. I'm involved with you, obviously, through the advisory board. We're running a number of very interesting events. Some of those are coming up. We have a really exciting one on the 30th of April in Manchester with the energy sector, and really how we can help support, massive challenges at scale, hitting in April, and some of these guys and their supply chains have really got to step up to the plate. And we're looking at how we can help that, how we can collaborate more, and how we can use things like data sharing on top of the type of MEGA.AI type tech that we're talking about today.
So for those that don't know about Mega, and they're probably seeing this, you for the first time, just address what challenge are we solving with our AI solution?
Okay, so just look at what we did at the Gherkin on the 29th of January. We brought a number of thought leaders together, along with regulators, subject matter experts. Mega sponsored that event, pretty exciting, but we were looking very much on that day around a consultation that Ofwat, which is the water regulator, had issued. We summarised through AI 34 responses. Chris Warburton, who's on the board with me, did a lot of that work. And we talked about some of the findings out of that in terms of how you can many more millions of consumers into the priority service register. So one of the challenges really was moving that from typically around 5% of one of the water providers' portfolios potentially up to 50%. Now, it's a gigantic scaling exercise. And that was right in the middle of just having a freeze across the UK as well as flooding, where some of these providers were having to register tens of thousands of consumers in the space of a couple of days. So a lot of this is around real spikes, recognition that more needs to be done in terms of consumer support at scale. And I think this is the interesting thing relative to Mega, both inbound and outbound. If you were given that challenge to be able to take on, let's say, 20,000 new consumers over the space of 2 days, is that feasible with traditional call center, contact center technology? Or if you need to scale the service, by an order of magnitude, a factor of 10 potentially, is that again feasible in terms of servicing both inbound as well as the recontact strategies, where you have to make sure you remain engaged with on an ongoing basis? So cost to serve is going up. Everybody can see that. And in conjunction with that, water and energy is going up again from April, as we're seeing, a general rise in costs across the board. And that's dramatically impacting some households.
What do you think is the most interesting finding from your point of view out of that report and the 34 responses we got? What do you think was most interesting? What was the most interesting finding for you?
Well, I think what we found was there was a lot of common ground, and I think that was quite important. The thing for me, I suppose, that excites me more is my background's in data sharing, certainly with credit reference bureaus, setting up closed user groups, and this goal that water, energy, and other essential service providers should collaborate more. And then
Yeah.
actually doing something so that if you have a provider like Mega, you have some insight when you're making contact with a customer, and particularly if they're registered with somebody like the vulnerability registration service, you actually understand how you're going to use that information and deliver a tailored service. And that's where I think some of the AI elements of it, particularly with API type technology, can use the information known and then readily adapt in real time to the engagement you've got with the consumer, which may be identification of vulnerability, identification of English not first language that you can readily tailor within your service. And I say at scale, which is really important.
Mm-hmm. What do you think they're doing now to reach those kind of numbers? What do you think they're doing now to get those registrations in play or
I
in
think what's
place?
interesting across it is there was a very cross section. So this is the area where there was some disparity. You had a number of the water providers in particular that were suggesting that 50% of their client portfolio wasn't in need of being on the priority service register. And I'd be inclined to agree with that. I think we're looking more in the territory of sort of 17, 18%. But that's still a big jump from 5%,
Yeah.
whatever way you look at it. And the fact that if we just look at pure numbers, there is a danger you drift into. You're eligible because you're over 65. You're eligible because you've got a child under 5. Does that make you vulnerable to something? Does it mean you need special needs? Probably not. So one of the key criteria is looking at what we looked at, and I'm a co-author of a document around actionable support needs that Chris Fitch has driven and was released in February. And there's over hundreds of what are called actionable support needs that you would readily use in some of these services. You can put conditional processing in to say, we've identified this. What do we need in terms of support needs to help this? Now, in water, that might be something very key where somebody's on a dialysis machine and as a result of that needs special support. In energy, you've got a lot of people that are reliant on the Internet of Things where they may have monitoring devices connected to NHS digital. If they go down, then some critical monitoring data may become unavailable. So a lot of people are not perpetually in a vulnerable state, but when an event occurs, suddenly they have to be prioritized. And I think what we're going to make sure is those eventualities, like the one where all your pipes freeze or that you have a major energy outage, ends up meaning that you have got recovery strategies. And as we mentioned earlier on, if you think about the Lloyds Bank app going down on payday or Barclays the month before or CrowdStrike last year, it's the recoverable events that said, right, was this avoidable? Possibly. But what's happened is a lot of people on payday haven't got the money in to pay their direct debits, and they're going to go into a position that could cause consumer detriment. So it's all about the recovery. It's a bit like a cyber
Yeah.
attack. It's less about the cyber attack itself and pointing fingers. It's about around putting the consumer first and then making sure that there is no consequent consumer detriment. So today we've actually seen some of the communications relative to the big nine banks and building societies around what they've done around these major incidents. And there's been quite a sizable number of them that have been fleshed out by recent government intervention to say, is this good enough? Where there is some old legacy technology that's actually meant these always seem to happen on critical days in the month.
What does a good recovery structure or process look like when these events happen?
So I think in the first instance, it's a recognition, it's a self-assessment really, that you're
Mm.
likely to be the root cause of the problem. So in many instances, somebody who is not in financial difficulty before or had critical payments to make or had a payroll to pay if they're a small business, that there should be some forbearance immediately. And there should be a very good communication strategy with the vast majority of their consumers. Now, most of us are familiar with our providers picking up the phone and you get in the message, we're experiencing exceptionally high volumes. And you
Yeah.
think, well, that seems to happen every bloody time I speak to you. Um, that's going to be doubly worse or worse than that in terms of the situations where you've got an incident, a major incident. So the more vulnerable in society, those in additional support need to deal with that anxiety, need to have comfort that everything is in hand. Nothing
Hmm.
awful will actually happen, and that there is some forbearance going to be put in play, recognizing the fact that many payments may be going out, as well as the expectation that if you don't get the money in, you may be able to get some support from your bank when many of them don't have a branch open in the locality anymore, and their inbound telephone service is only geared to a certain level of capacity.
So what does good look like then? If an AI strategy or an AI program is put in place to help with these recovery strategies or these situations. I remember, what was it, about 3 years ago, I woke up in the morning and all the water was off. I had no messages on my phone. I was expecting a text message. I had no calls. I had no email. I called up the water company and I said, "Hey, look, did you cut my water off because I didn't pay the bill or something?" And they didn't even know. And then come to find out, I looked out the kitchen window and saw down the street that they were doing some waterworks down the road. So I went over and asked them, and he goes, "Yeah, look, we could bring you buckets of water to your house, um, but yeah, your water's going to be off for probably the next 6 to 7 hours." I got to take a shower and get to work. Like, what the hell is going on? Why haven't you guys told me anything? And something just as small as that, and then you've got the whole street, and then the whole town, and then if that happens across the nation, that's quite crazy. So what does a good recovery strategy look like?
Yeah, so I'm working on the basis that you will be in the general population, that you don't need additional support. Having a shower and looking smart to go to work are normally, considerations, but they're not emergencies. So we
Yeah,
talked about the dialysis scenario earlier on. There are a lot of people here that it's not just the clean water, it's the
yeah.
sewage water as well, where they may suffer in conditions, particularly where they've had, maybe a stoma bag installed, something similar, where you're going to end up with special needs on it. But I think all of this starts with trust. And one of the hardest things when you have an emergency, I suspect, is you start getting random text messages and other communications, and that's assuming you've got accurate details on your database.
Yeah.
You've got to work out whether it's a spoof or not. And most of us now are particularly cynical that when you get something out of the blue, that is it really true? Is it really the case that there's somebody's communicated with you? Now, in the case of your water disappearing or your energy going off, you're going to spot it fairly early on. So
Hmm.
there's probably going to be the fact that your mobile phone is probably one of the few devices available to you that's not reliant on either water or energy
Yeah.
at that point in time. So um, that trust factor to me is really important. Capacity management really important in the instance where you're likely to have massive overflows and spikes in demand. What you want, particularly with some of the services like Mega, you almost have, unlimited capacity to treat with inbound. but then
Yeah.
you also then got to be able to hand off to human beings or take them down particular use cases that are readily identifiable from that sort of bot type technology. So I think the clever bits are, like we've talked about before, English not first language, the ability to detect that, sentiment analytics where you're finding out that somebody is anxious, stressed, and you want to probably simplify some of these journeys, including things like enrollment in the priority service register. Should be a
Mm-hmm.
very easy journey. It shouldn't require a human being to be involved in it, but the choice is always there for the consumer. But what you're making sure is your service is available to answer the telephone, whatever other means you offer, whether that's web chat, email, SMS, etc. And then on outbound, that there are follow-up activities that can be undertaken where you can do that at scale,
Mm-hmm.
where you're not reliant on the number of bums on seats in a particular contact center, which is only resourced for, BAU. So,
Yeah.
so I think here capacity management is one of the obvious areas where it can work, but ideally you want it to be an extension of the core service. And
Yeah.
talk about things like omni-channel. It's not a bolt-on to an old legacy system, which is one of the criticisms of some of the larger institutions is they're trying to do an awful lot, not necessarily on their own agenda. In the regulatory space I work in, there's been a lot of stuff going on concurrently. So, like the consumer duty in the Financial Conduct Authority world, alongside operational resilience, alongside product sales data, alongside lots of other strategic changes that have been required, and that really has stretched some of the firms in terms of what they can do, what they can't do, and then can influence their role as to whether they outsource or not.
Mm-hmm. So look. That's a ton of information to get right into the first 16 minutes. So let's backtrack a little bit. I want to rewind to a time, let's say after high school or college. What was it that got you into this industry?
So I probably did a degree in rugby, if truth be known, when I went to University of Surrey originally, but I did mathematics and computer science and was involved in doing some of the maths in putting a satellite up, which, if you think in those days, you probably about a 3K of memory and everybody was fighting for the same IT resources. But you had some pretty clever stuff going on. My industrial year was with Unisys, where we were involved, as I say, in global wholesale banking, the SWIFT project, and then downsizing from mainframe computers to what were mini computers. So there were often vexing problems that weren't just to how you code this, but thinking about how do you cram this into this device that really hasn't got a huge amount of processing power and certainly
Mm-hmm.
hasn't got very much memory, to being able to go into technology when I moved to Infolink, that prior to Equifax acquiring it, where we were dealing with hundreds of millions of records in terms of consumer searches that were going on, you know, vast levels of information that were happening both online and in batch. And you had almost unlimited tech resource, which was great. So you could actually
Mm-hmm.
write things that were designed to provide sub-second responses, which in those days was pretty good, but didn't ever go down because in those days, if you went down, then Experian, as they were then, stepped in, and vice versa. So
Mm-hmm.
that operational resilience was just as important as some of the innovation that was put into place, and those requirements have stayed with me forever. The ability to put new databases in place, integrate that information, and then apply our analytics over the top of it. But it had to be done safely. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever you released anything, and I know the world now where we are at the moment, where you've got concurrent agile projects going on and doing multiple deliveries in one day, a lot of the same principles still apply. That it
Mm-hmm.
may well be fintech, it may be agile, it may be this, but you've still got to make sure the service works and it's resilient. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that was some of the really deep grounding I had. I then moved into more the receivables management, where I looked after 22 countries across Europe, and then trying to deploy tech platforms where there was a sort of 85% commonality across those territories, working with very large providers like American Express and others that, obviously they were originated in the States, but they provided services across the globe.
Hmm.
So trying to find the synergies as well as recognizing what was different from territory to territory was pretty important. Making sure it was scalable, make sure it was redeployable. And again, in each country, you might have a different credit reference agency that you needed to work with. So a lot of that was pretty interesting, the work I did with mergers, acquisitions from Equifax into Interim Justicia, um, and looking at what technologies could be lifted and shifted versus what needed to be tailored to any given market. And I became relatively independent and involved in the .com world, raising quite a lot of money, and then doing that with people like MySAP, where they were technology platforms that were looking to offer small businesses, consumer type trust platforms. And that really was the start of getting involved in a lot of initiatives, setting up different firms, working with them. So in those days with credit professionals, setting up Lowell Group with a funder. They're now obviously one of the largest debt purchasers in the UK. But it was
Hmm.
pretty innovative when you're doing that in the early days with the founding directors there and the funders, and a target to get acquiring within a very short period of time and mobilizing. So those challenges in terms of how you go to market still stay with me today, very
Hmm.
much in mind, very much part of the MEGA.AI approach.
Yeah.
How do we land the technology in different geographies? How do we work with people like the Vulnerability Registration Service, where they've got an eminently portable platform that could work in almost any geography, where there's nothing about the VRS that makes it specific to the UK. So all of the things I think we're looking at collectively, Shane, I think are very interesting when you look into leverage different technologies. And some of those,
Hmm.
the uses of AI I'm involved with, some of them are around consumer understanding, intelligibility. So I've recently done an event with a company called Amplified Global that is
Hmm.
FCA Sandbox, worked on their Innovate UK project, where they're looking at how you genuinely pitch not only contractual terms, but anything that forms part of the client journey, the website, some of the preamble, post contractual documentation, so you can pitch it to the right level of intelligibility. And everywhere we go, we're finding different applications for AI. Recently done a quality assurance event where agent assist type toolings, real time speech analytics are now becoming into play, becoming vitally important to actually intervene early, and how you can actually address, some of the regulatory requests. So this year we've got what's called product sales data from the FCA, and start capturing July time this year. But it is every single credit agreement is being monitored by the regulator. So
Hmm.
the old days of doing 4 assessments per agent per month just don't cut it anymore. You've got to use other tooling to say, how do you keep oversight, particularly with the duty and the board reporting, that you feel comfortable at night that your business is being governed well and you're getting the right type of management information in a timely manner to say, I can intervene if we're delivering poor consumer outcomes.
All right. So again, just backtracking a little bit, you seem to have worked a lot in the field. How many years did you spend in the field before you shifted into independent consultant work?
So I graduated, 84, and by the time I think I got to 2002 is when I set my consultancy business up. Originally, I've got several, uh,
Yeah.
and then I've also been a non-exec director or executive director for a number of firms in the interim period. So I like to walk the talk as well as talking the talk. So in many firms, the commitment I had was, can you do this and can you deliver it? So and some of that I've stepped outside of that comfort zone. So between 2019, for example, and 2021, I worked with Capgemini as an independent, went to HMRC and worked on a $220 million contact engagement
Ooh.
program, 7 major procurements. Initially I thought was going in just on an interim basis. It timed with the debt relief scheme, so what's called breathing space, that had to be deployed by May 2021. and I was on the Treasury working parties, so I had some subject matter expertise. But it rapidly evolved when March 20 happened, and
Yeah.
30,000 people at HMRC had to go and work from home. Um, that in itself was a challenge to everybody involved. But I regarded that as a huge opportunity to uplift
Yeah.
my tech skills, particularly with sort of Gartner top 5 technology around contact management, web chat, the whole area around CRM, AI, databasing around AWS, Azure type platforms at massive scale in one of the most secure environments you can imagine. So quite a lot of challenges. So being a program manager in that was pretty exciting. Again, applying that in what was an agile world, but to civil service type standards. So some things they did exceptionally well. Some of the government digital standards are very good
Yeah.
baseline. And I set up an academy with Pega there that was part sponsored by Capgemini. And again, that was to try and develop skills within HMRC, which were very expensive in the outside world, and trying to find the balance between people want to work for the civil service as well as being able to earn decent salaries and develop their career. So that again was pretty enlightening. I've always been involved in training and competence schemes, and that is still to the fore to this day, whether that is with a small business or very large ones. So I'm involved in several apprenticeship schemes, some from grassroots in the debt advice sector, and that's a very important part of what we do. You've got to have those training and competence skills. But
Yeah.
increasingly, with the advent of AI, how do you use that to augment agent capability with some of the AI capability that should be readily available in terms of agent assist?
So, a quick one before we get into that. We've got the last half an hour for that. But when you again were in the operation, you mentioned that you. It's very. This is always very interesting for me. This is something I want to be doing eventually. Something that Mega's doing right now in terms of raising money. But how did you get from being on the field, working within the business, to helping raise? Like, what happened in your company? Did you say, "I want to help do this"? Did they say, "Kevin, we want your help with this"? And then you did it, and then you shifted to being like an
So
independent consultant. How did that work?
it started corporately. So if I go all the way back to UAPT Infolink, I was part of the acquisition team to HPI that many people will recall. If you wanted to check a car, whether it was on finance, whether it had been subject to a crash, been welded together again. HPI
Yeah,
at that time had a monopoly. I was part of the due diligence team with KPMG, going all the way back to 1990, I suppose, and then looking at um, following that, Equifax was acquired. I was one of the few remaining directors of that. Part of my remit was mergers, acquisitions. That brought me into contact into different territories. We moved into Spain, Portugal, looked very closely at France, Italy, and other territories. And interim justitia came across our radar. Um, at that time, Equifax then decided to globally get out of both the insurance sector and collections, and I then had almost a role reversal, which was to get involved with Interim to delist it in the UK, relist it in the Swedish market, and grow partly through acquisition. And the former owner Bo Goranson at the time was very acquisitive, and fairly unorthodox in how he did that. Often it was done over dinner, and you had to bring in some of the disciplines you've been used to, probably in more corporate world as part of a Nasdaq listed firm. But it was very exciting. We ended up going to territories that I certainly wouldn't have ever have gone to. Certainly the Baltic states and parts of Eastern Europe, and you decided very quickly where your boundaries were. So in those days, we probably drew a line. Anything east of Hungary, Czech Republic, and Poland. Now, obviously, people are venturing much further into that. But it wasn't just the business; it was the tech as well.
hmm
So St. Pete's, Budapest, and others were all pretty good tech centres, and people were gravitating there. Where you were looking at, what is the cost of production of some of the new fintech type solutions, even
hmm
integrating them into big tech like SAP, Oracle, Great Plains, going all the way down to QuickBooks and Sage. In the world that we lived in around accounts receivable. So
Hmm.
all those dimensions. So the tech background has always been with me. I'd like to
Yeah.
think I am tech savvy. I'm not saying
Yeah.
that I am a propeller head in the real true sense of the word, but I get what the capability of some of the new technologies are. And that's really always what attracts me when we're dealing with new firms is what is the opportunity? Is it a problem waiting to find a solution, or is it a solution waiting to try and find a problem? And often when you're dealing with individuals who are looking to raise money, you can find fairly early on whether it is an innovator who's got no sales capability, or is it a salesman who's got no tech capability or no finance capability. And it's filling the gaps and looking where to strengthen the proposition, particularly if you're going to have to go through a regulatory application process or actually be subject to quite tight scrutiny from investors who often have some of the brightest guys around, certainly in doing financial analysis. And, that's probably not my forte, but I'm certainly well versed in dealing with the people
Hmm.
engaged in that space.
What do you think it was that worked so well about your acquisition strategy? And tell me a little bit about the strategy itself.
Well, the first thing you've got to say is you've got to kiss quite a few frogs to get successful outcomes. So I think you've got to be realistic around that. So if I'm acting now these days for somebody who wants to acquire or undertake a change in control, you're always going to make sure your research work is good to start off with. But, in my world, contacts are everything,
Mm,
networking skills. I'd like to think I'm pretty well connected, and you use and leverage those contacts all the time. And you keep your ear very close to the ground. One of the values I've got in terms of being a director of a trade body is I produce a bulletin every week that keeps my knowledge up to date, and I get fed quite a lot of very useful information, most of which is in the public domain, and that helps your view in terms of what's coming on the horizon. Are the distressed sales that might be interested versus those firms that want to scaffold and grow. So if I'm working the other side of it, it's understanding where they are in that journey. Is it first round funding, second, third? What are they wanting to do? Where are the directors in that? Are they in a very leveraged position to start off with, or are they now in a position that some of them want to exit? So
mm.
understanding the motivations, being very pragmatic, and sometimes it does require you to be very pragmatic in looking at this sort of situation when you are trying to marry together two parties to find out whether there's going to be a cultural fit.
So, what was your first taste of AI like, and what did you see?
So most of it, I would say, is going to be relatively low key, not normally consumer facing. It's something that's going on in the back end. So you're seeing a lot of things where it's been used. Back office claims management is a good area on that, where it's able to do quite a lot of work for you without it necessarily being highly visible, and providing a lot of automation, OPEX type projects that you might see. But alongside that, you will see the occasional thing that I've sponsored very heavily firms like Inicio AI with their conversational AI budgie tool. Now,
Mm,
I just watched from afar as they've developed and evolved, and they've used a lot of greenhouse type funds. They've gone involved in a lot of these, accelerator processes, but they had a very good use case. And when you're looking at that, affordability is something that's crucially important. And we're beginning to see this blend between, are we going to wake up one day and there's a co-pilot or as a chat GPT that's going to overtake somebody's proprietary product? And that is always one of the challenges here.
mm,
How do you make the most of your opportunity whilst you've got first mover advantage? Um, and if I look at some of that things where you're looking at some of the clever stuff that sits underneath it, by and large, it is something that it's got to be built on good data. So I'm a bit of a data freak. Data has always been there. So what we've done with things like the intelligibility score, where we've used machine learning and artificial intelligence within that process with a partner like FinVents, they're data geeks. but we're dealing with a huge amount of data, and that's the only way that we could have actually, generated some of the score and decision logic that we've got.
For those that don't know, what is an intelligibility score?
So in this particular instance, what we looked at is I do a lot of work, as I told you, in the debt management world, but that includes personal insolvency. And here we've got a sector that's been under the cosh a little bit in the last sort of 5 or 6 years, particularly around the issue of mis-selling, particularly to people that are financially vulnerable. The Insolvency Service did a very limited data request on individual voluntary arrangements that failed in the first year. My partner and I, Peter Wordsworth, decided to take a data-driven approach. We collected more than 50% of the IVAs across the sector going back to 2017, used 70% of that data to try and prove that we could build a predictive score that would identify whether that debt remedy would survive 3 years. So it's about
Mm-hmm.
sustainability. So that
Mm-hmm.
sustainability of anything, whether it be a time to pay earlier in the cycle, whether it be sustainability in a debt management plan or sustainability in individual voluntary arrangement, that principle is there. Can I use data where you've had to use AI in that model because of the scale of it to work out what the nuances are, including some behavioral science, to give comfort not only to the insolvency practitioner, but to creditors receiving proposals that this looks like a relatively safe bet. And in an IVA, the creditors do vote whether they support it or they don't or want to vary it. So that scores, in my view, and again, I'm one of the co-directors that founded it with Peter. My view is that data-driven approach is pretty important, and that you've got enough there to be able to prove that this has got substance, and you update it on a very regular basis so it continues to learn.
So, what do you think is the best use case? Let's just say a year out from now, if you can push it out that far, what will be the best use case of how AI is used in a debt management world?
So we're already seeing this. So the FCA are very, very progressive in this space. So they do have a pathways scheme, so you can go in and test and learn using, in some instances, synthetic data, in other areas, just aggregated data, and a number of firms in this area. So people like PayPlan, Money Wellness, Money Plus Group, I believe, Angel Advance, all have looked at this type of this approach where they are larger players in this space to try and sense check whether their model is going in the right direction. Now, that will use a hint of AI, where I think we're beginning to get to, which is part of the project I did with Innovate UK and Amplified, was can we actually use some of this tooling to deliver better suitability statements that are intelligible? So could an 11-year-old, somebody with a reading age of 11, read it? At the same time, use some of the tools, chat GPT type, that help with the wrap at the end of the call, that give efficiencies, so that you end up finding that actually AI has played probably 2 or 3 roles in that journey, one of which might be to interpret the credit report, another which may be interpreting the open banking, another to actually look at some of that to actually strengthen the recommendation made by the debt advisor, and then maybe shortening the wrap, maybe 10, 20 minutes in a call, and that then goes into the communication that's delivered to a smartphone with layering back to the consumer to recognize that sort of 84, 85% of consumers now engage through their smartphone. So it's not just one thing, it's a combination.
Mm-hmm.
I think those tools, where they fit into that journey pretty seamlessly, I think we're going to begin to see more and more often. And some of it's going to be a Marmite moment. Some, journeys, the firm, it's their culture, may say, I absolutely always want, the consumer to speak to a human being. But that may be just the last 10 minutes. And, the system, which may be hugely digital, may have taken you through all the non-advice activities prior to that.
So let's go back to your safeguarding question and how it connects to innovation, or what you should be mindful of in that case. What kind of things are worrying you, or not worrying you? Let's say, what kind of instances or situations concern you when it comes to AI safety?
So one of the things that I find, again, because I tend to be at a strategic consultancy level, is through the course of 2024 and prior to that, the Financial Conduct Authority set out its expectations, which included the safe use of AI, but also promoting it as a way of innovation. And what we found was a lot of firms in the debt sector, in the widest sense, debt purchasers, debt collectors, lenders themselves in their debt recovery units, started to dabble in AI. So what we started finding was everything had AI plugged on the end of it. And it wasn't until June last year when the FCA started sending out data requests, which interestingly were about consumer support. And it started off at the headline, which is, tell me about your contact center in your telephony. What's the average wait time on a call? How do you handle outbound? So far, so good. Into email. So far, so good. Into SMS. And then it asked this killer question, which said, do you use AI? If you answer yes to that question, please then go and complete the next set of questions, which are about to catch you out because you probably find out that you haven't got an AI governance policy in your business because you just plugged this bloody thing in and haven't thought about the wider picture of explainability and direction of travel of where the FCA and the ICO were going. So a lot of what I've seen in deployment was quite tactical. And when you talk about omni-channel versus multi-channel, multi-channel was generally the direction of travel, which is I can bolt on this bit, I can bolt on that bit, but I don't have a cohesive strategy across the board. And if I look at all of my contact management, could I bring all my customer-centric MI together for my first duty board report, which was July last year, and evidence to the regulator? I've got a coordinated campaign around contact engagement, vulnerability, and a number of other metrics. And often it was evidencing that actually it's a bit patchy. And if you were to ask me anything outside of the main contact strategy, I'd have to go off and do a body of work or chuck a load of stuff in a data warehouse to be able to get some, useful information of a comparable nature. So quality assurance, my sector has just gone through a month where they've had to supply by the 3rd of March a quality assurance framework survey, which included a data submission. But what you're beginning to see is everybody's got a fairly good idea of what good looks like for QAing a telephone call.
Mm-hmm.
They don't really know too well what that looks like if the journey is a mixture of an app, a call with somebody, a couple of SMSs, an email, and then a portal. So
Yeah.
can you put that journey together and QA it? And does a vulnerable customer get as good an outcome through that channel as they do through your total telephony journey with a bit of an agent assist? You're getting people scratching their heads and going, I don't really know about that. And in concurrently with that, my sector also had a series of fair value assessment interviews with 4 members of the FCA. Obviously they've got time on their hands, but 4 often to 1, where they're talking about how you evidence fair value, often with somebody who's got characteristics of vulnerability. And how have you used channel management? Is that channel management around you actually trying to do this for cost efficiency point of view? So
Yeah.
every bit of R&D you invest, it helps your profitability. Or are you actually turning it around and said, this investment is helping me to be financially resilient, but also offer, preferential prices to clients that do engage through certain channels?
Jesus. All right. So, with that in mind, what is on your plate for the next 12 to 18 months, specifically related to AI?
So I think, again, it's trying to move certain technologies out of its infancy, and some of them very much are still in that pilot stage, proof of concept, into something that can be scaled. To me, when you can get something quasi-industrialized and it's a core part of everyday service, then to me, it's a big step forward. So looking at that maturity factor, taking on board that the regulators are embracing it. And if you believe the government, which, you've got to take a clear view on this as to what the government is trying to do in terms of making the UK a more attractive place to come and invest, is that because we're in dire straits and we need to put some money in the coffers, or is there a legitimate commitment here to actually say we really want to promote innovation, but in a safe environment, and therefore
Hmm.
do we use some of these, innovation hubs, pathways that the ICO, the FCA have set up to enable scalable solutions to be developed, particularly in the type of area that we're talking about, Shane, which said, would you trust a bot to communicate with millions of people where we're dealing with something where there may have been a major incident that consumers need support on, where at the moment that is not relatively well catered for in lots of vertical markets?
How do you stay up to date with so much? Like you just like an open book, encyclopedia of information. You know so much about so much of the market. How do you stay up to date when there's so much information available?
Well, I'll give credit to Chris Warburton here. Well, he and I have a couple of old, people conversations over a cup of coffee fairly regularly. But we've just produced a new regulatory update for every month. But that is using a combination of our knowledge, but the AI itself to go and research what's hitting, what's trending, what the horizon scans are. My personal view is I don't do that for a theoretic kick. I do it as to the practical implementation. So my Dempster bulletin at the moment is geared around the audience I'm serving. So on a Saturday, about 500 get the bulletin, and I try and find use cases and collaborations there which are suggestive of something that could be going somewhere. Similarly, if there have been a few disasters, what's going to be the Betamax of the industry, if everybody can remember that far back? Um, but generally speaking, there are a lot of collaborations going on at the moment, which suggests partnerships are really important, and that you need to get that collective mindset between somebody who understands the sector really well with somebody who understands the opportunity and others that understand how the data can work for you.
So you've mentioned Dempster a few times, and you're a co-author of it, and you do a lot of updates there too. What is Dempster for those that aren't aware of what it is or don't or aren't familiar with it?
So the Debt Managers Standards Association was set up really to be a representative trade body of those who are debt solution providers. And historically that meant they provided debt management plans. The world has changed really since 2016, when most of the firms had to apply from interim permissions with the Financial Conduct Authority to get full permissions, and the sector itself suffered quite badly. A lot of players fell out of the market, and some would have taken the view for the better. But the reality was the capacity in the market reduced, and the sector has been under a severe strain in terms of how it's funded going forward, both from the debt charities point of view and the wider for-profit firms more generally. So there's been an awful lot of scrutiny of the sector. Now, during the course of that increased my focus on the fintech firms that were supporting the sector as we began to see more and more needs. So, if you look at some of the clever providers in MEGA.AI, policy and practice, they're focusing on things like benefit calculators, income optimization, where again, that ability to go off and analyze open banking data, credit reports to find out whether somebody is entitled to more disposable income, which is obviously critical for somebody in problem debt. How
Hmm.
some of these other tools help with consumer understanding as it's crystallized with the consumer duty. Those that are specifically open banking providers, how you then look across multiple bank accounts and can take a view, at an affordable level, because some of these tools are quite expensive if they're done at scale,
Hmm.
give you insights, and that deals with this double-edged sword. I used to be a founding director of the Credit Industry Fraud Avoidance Scheme and Registry Trust, which holds the county court judgments. Now, originally, you used to have a sort of clear daylight between somebody who was felt was a fraudster and somebody who was vulnerable. Now,
Yeah.
that line is blurring. There is a requirement around financial crime. You've seen a lot more communication around things like money mules. You're seeing a lot more communication around economic abuse, coercion, typically women being coerced. And if the economic abuse figures hold true. I've got no reason to doubt them. It's something like 11.5 million women have had some form of economic abuse. Now, what that means in real terms is you might identify cases when you look at somebody's, credit record and you speak to them, that two or three of the credit accounts they may have, that they're in their name, but they're not the ones who were, blasted it and took it to credit limit. Now, we're finding again with illegal money lending, so loan sharks, the presence of that type of data. Realistically, if you're dealing with somebody who's subject to having a loan shark in their life, a debt collector, a lender, and a debt advisor are really not going to have a huge amount of impact whilst that person's in their life. Because in debt levels rise from a ridiculous £90 to tens of thousands of pounds, and until the people are arrested and taken off the street, these consumers live in fear of what's going to happen every day. And some of these manifest themselves from, an old lady in the school playing ground approaching a young mum who's in financial difficulty. Not everything is characterized by somebody that looks out of, some form of Eastern European, you know, sci-fi type film with people with tattoos from head to foot. It is a societal problem at the moment, and that people tend to keep quiet. There are very few disclosures, so you end up having to do that yourself and picking up the type of transactions that Stop Loan Sharks England are very good at training. So again, going back to my ethos with Chris on training, we do promote a lot of free training from people like GamCare, people like Stop Loan Sharks, who are highlighting issues that are very common in the UK, but often not talked about an awful lot, but are becoming more and more prevalent when you're doing and assessing somebody that may be in financial difficulty.
Wow, that is insane. That is absolutely crazy. So, last question. What is trending in the debt management world right now? A key insight that can give a CEO, business owner, competitive edge.
Well, I think, we've talked about the pilot projects. I always think that sort of test and learn approach is really important. And I think you've got to look at the right use cases. And that may differ from one firm to another. So if you're going to go out and make yourself clear that you want to be the top customer experience provider, then you've got to be able to evidence that you're doing something that's in the consumer's best interest. If you want to be the cheapest, and you're going to declare the fact that you are the cheapest, that mediocrity might be okay as long as it's this side of the rules, then those drivers are important. But I often find that people are trying to go for both, and often
Yeah.
it doesn't work. So you need to know culturally what the ambition is, and that there aren't mixed objectives when you're doing it. There's got to be commitment from the top. But in debt management at the moment, I do feel there are going to be some themes. On the 11th of March, we've got the FCA vulnerability report, which will talk about what they've observed since February 2021. I'm not expecting to make great reading, because through 2024, they highlighted large interventions with major tier one banks, big finance houses. You've got the Motor Finance Commission debacle going on at the moment, which has highlighted poor practices in terms of consumer understanding and practices themselves in selling vehicles and motor finance alongside it. So I think there will be areas here that firms will be steered into that are going to relate to how do I address some of these areas. Consumer understanding of the planks that sit under consumer duty. So we've got product design, price and value, and consumer support. Those have been sort of done to death a little bit in terms of deep dives. Consumer understanding, it's only really been fairly abstract at the moment. So I think that dimension is going to be very important, and that will bring in things like English not first language, which I think is going to be a major issue as our country becomes more and more multicultural. And that multicultural element is going to go way beyond just language. It is going to be going, and some of this does align with some of the issues around economic abuse, where you have different cultural values that need to be acknowledged and probably accommodated in different customer journeys. And that includes, who do you pay first? Where you've got a society at the moment that seems to become paranoid about what their credit score is. You look
Yep.
at influencers, everything that's on telly, the ability for you to sit there with your boxer dog, and the boxer dog can use the smartphone to get a better credit score than its owner. It's sort of taking things to an extreme. But why is it then that they don't pay their tax? Why don't they pay their energy bill, or their council tax, which could have much more significant connotations? So some of the financial education piece that's embedded in these journeys is often understated, and you often get a big pointy finger exercise, which is, whose job is it to do that? Should it be the schools? When you're actually in junior school, should it be
Mm.
before you're let out? In later life when you go through your GCSEs? Should it be when you're at university? Should it be the whole way through your life? So financial education, embedding financial education in the journeys, how you do that cleverly without it feeling like it's patronizing, I think is quite an interesting area where you're using AI, and you're using that in a proportionate manner, where you may have somebody that needs to be educated but in bite-sized chunks. You
Hmm.
probably don't want to know the whole legal system when you first take out a credit agreement. You probably do when somebody's threatening a county court judgment and what your rights are. So there's a time and place for everything. And certainly the stuff I'm doing with Amplified, it suggests you need to understand the contract and where it becomes important. So if you are in financial difficulty, what could be the next steps in this consumer credit agreement, when you perhaps weren't paying a lot of attention when you were looking at the shiny new iPhone, or the red car over there that is what you were looking to purchase. And I often feel sometimes we've got an imbalance in that between what a consumer should be considering to make an informed decision and what onus is being put on the provider, where you probably haven't got full bandwidth, where somebody's, actually their mind is somewhere else. And you certainly see that a lot when you're dealing in the debt recovery, debt resolution world, where somebody might be doing the washing up or driving their car when they're trying to have a dialogue with you. So there has to be a balance here,
Yeah.
somebody to make an informed decision. And that brings about its own challenges in consumer understanding, which is, how do you assess that somebody is understanding? And this is where I think the bots have got a lot to play, without you sounding like a parrot at the end of every sentence, which is how you see most IVRs at the moment, which said, you said, Kevin, that your date of birth was this. Is that correct? And you've lost the will to live after about 30 seconds.
You're so right. So, Kevin, last question, and then we're going to wrap it up. What is the best advice you ever received, and that advice helped you shift a massive change in your life?
I've probably been multiple events in my life. I think probably my wife trying to get me to and get the right work-life balance at the moment. But in my
Okay.
in my earlier career, I would certainly say that if you were going to live life to the edge, certainly when I was playing rugby as well as trying to go up the executive ladder, it
Yep.
it was making sure that integrity was key, that you stuck to your word. So if you committed to something, you delivered it, and you learnt lessons where if you'd over promised, that you learnt from that fairly quickly afterwards. So for me, integrity is key. I like to be able to deliver what I promise, and I like to be regarded as a hugely trustworthy person, and that to me is a key facet in anything I look for in other people, that integrity is there. And I look for that when I'm looking at mergers, acquisitions, partnerships, and the like, that those factors are in evidence.
Would you say anything to your younger self, let's say when you was 20 years old, in your 20s, was there anything you'd like to say or would have said to your 20-year-old self that you know now that you wish you knew back then?
I wish I was better at prioritizing. So if I applied some of the things I do now, when you look at an opportunity or a risk, And when you weigh that up, the pros and cons of it, probably a bit more impetuous in those days when you looked at it. And that's probably why my body's in the state it's in now, with false shoulders and various other ailments that don't go back and try and play too quickly after you've recovered from an injury. And probably the same in business life as well, that going off and pursuing your own personal crusade, and you look at it on balance and said, was that the right thing to do? Were there other priorities that should have come ahead of that?
Amazing. Kevin, it's been an absolute privilege and a reward. What is the best place for people to come and message you, find out more, learn about you?
So Kevin Still Consulting on LinkedIn, Dempster on LinkedIn, Consumer Duty Services on LinkedIn. All will get hold of me, and you can see a cross-section of what I do and the sort of networking and collaboration I'm all about. If you're involved in the vulnerability space, then very much I would recommend looking at what the Vulnerability Registration Service is doing, including the work they're doing with MEGA at the moment, because we've got some really interesting stuff on the go, which I hope will influence regulatory strategy as well as best practice in the sector.
I think that's all. That's all for today. Thank you very much, Kevin. And that is a wrap.